sentimental, the romance between her and Swiveller underplayed, with always a vein of humour running through the whole. Despite her physical frailty, she is willing to face anything, and is a pointed contrast to the heroine of the book, Nell, who is often morose, depressed, and struggling under the burden of caring for her ailing grandfather. The great set piece of the novel is the fate of Little Nell, and as the time approached to write it, Dickens was possessed with a kind of creative madness. "All night I have been pursued by the child," he wrote at the height of the novel's genesis, and he admitted that he cried as he wrote it. He seemed to have to experience those extremes of emotion to be able to write about them. "Nobody will miss her, like I shall," he wrote to his friend and first biographer, John Forster. The old curiosity shop strengthened the bond between Dickens and his public. "It made a greater impression," Dickens said, "than any other of my writings." Quilp and Mrs. Quilp.
"Go on, ladies, go on," said Daniel. "Mrs. Quilp, pray ask the ladies to stop to supper, and have a couple of lobsters and something light and palatable."
I didn't ask them to tea, Quilp," stammered his wife. "It's quite an accident."
"So much the better, Mrs. Quilp. These accidental parties are always the pleasantest," said the dwarf, rubbing his hands so hard that he seemed to be engaged in manufacturing, of the dirt with which they were encrusted, little charges for pop-guns. "What? Not going, ladies? You're not going, surely?" His fair enemies tossed their heads slightly as they sought their respective bonnets and shawls, but left all verbal contention to Mrs. Genuine, who, finding herself in the position of champion, made a faint struggle to sustain the character. "And why not stop to supper, Quilp?" said the old lady. "If my daughter had a mind." "To be sure," rejoined Daniel. "Why not?" "There's nothing dishonest or wrong in a supper, I hope," said Mrs. Genuine. "Surely not," returned the dwarf. "Why should there be? Nor anything unwholesome either, unless there's lobster salad or prawns, which I'm told are not good for digestion." "And you wouldn't like your wife to be attacked with that or anything else that would make her uneasy, would you?" said Mrs. Genuine. "Not for a score of worlds," replied the dwarf with a grin. "Not even to have a score of mothers-in-law at the same time, and what a blessing that would be." "My daughter's your wife, Mr. Quilp, certainly," said the old lady with a giggle, meant for satirical, and to imply that he needed to be reminded of the fact. "Your wedded wife?" "So she is, certainly, so she is," observed the dwarf. "And she has a right to do as she likes, I hope, Quilp," said the old lady, trembling, partly with anger and partly with a secret fear of her impish son-in-law. "Hope she has," he replied. "Oh, don't you know she has? Don't you know she has, Mrs. Genuine?" "I know she ought to have, Quilp, and would have if she was of my way of thinking." "Why ain't you of your mother's way of thinking, my dear?" said the dwarf, turning round and addressing his wife. "Why don't you always imitate your mother, my dear? She's the ornament of her sex. Your father said so every day of his life. I'm sure he did." "Her father was a blessed creature, Quilp, and worthy 20,000 of some people," said Mrs. Genuine. 20,000,000,000. "I should like to have known him," remarked the dwarf. "I dare say he was a blessed creature then, but I'm sure he is now. It was a happy release. I believe he had suffered a long time." The old lady gave a gasp, but nothing came of it. Quilp resumed, with the same malice in his eye and the same sarcastic politeness on his tongue. "You look ill, Mrs. Genuine. I know you have been exciting yourself too much. Talking, perhaps, for it is your weakness. Go to bed. Do go to bed." "I shall go when I please, Quilp, and not before." "But please to do now." "Do please to go now," said the dwarf. The old woman